do you think that really we have enough evidence for the crucifixion? Because we are not sure that the Bible is saying the truth. And we are worried that the Bible is not countable. And their word before our word. And I mean, it's this for that. Quran is saying this, Christianity is saying that. Who knows? So,
Yeah.
do you think so?
For the crucifixion of Jesus and his death by crucifixion, I can say a few things. So first, the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, the historical evidence, is very strong. So strong that even atheist New Testament scholars, those who reject the existence of any kind of a personal creator, God of the universe, they think that the death of Jesus by crucifixion in the first century is one of the best attested facts of the ancient world. So I cite someone like John Dominic Crossan and Gert Ludemann, atheist New Testament scholars. Well, Crossan doesn't like to be referred to as an atheist, but he has said that he does not believe in a personal creator of the universe. There's no personal being who created the universe in Crossan's mind. So, I call that an atheist. He can call it what he wants. But there's plenty of critical or skeptical New Testament scholars who reject the existence of God, who reject the resurrection of Jesus, but they'll still say the death of Jesus by crucifixion is one of the best attested facts in the ancient world. Why? Well, you have early sources like the oral tradition preserved in 1 Corinthians 15 that talks about Jesus' death. You have Paul mentions it in his letters. You have it in the Gospels. All of this that I'm mentioning is written within 65 years of the death of Jesus. You've got Josephus, a Jewish historian, non-Christian, so he's unsympathetic to the Christian cause. And he mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And although it is true that is a disputed passage in terms of whether Josephus said everything in that text, that is in the current Greek text of that. The overwhelming abundance of Josephus specialists today will say that Josephus certainly mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion by Pontius Pilate in there at minimum. You have Tacitus, the Roman historian, one of the finest, perhaps the finest Roman historian, writing in the early part of the 2nd century. He mentions Jesus' execution by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. You have Lucian of Samosata. He was hostile to the Christian faith, writing around the year 150, so maybe 120 years or so after Jesus' death. He mentions Jesus' death by crucifixion in Palestine. You have Mar Serapion, a Jewish prisoner facing execution sometime either in the latter part of the 1st century or sometime in the 2nd century. We can't narrow the date more than that. And he mentions Jesus's execution at the instigation of the Jewish leadership. The chances of surviving crucifixion are very small. So number one, our documentary evidence is very strong that Jesus died by crucifixion. The chances of surviving crucifixion, number two, are very small. So of all the reports of crucifixions in antiquity, there are only 2 instances reported of a person surviving. One is in Herodotus. We don't know much about that one at all. Doesn't really give any details, but the person was removed intentionally in order so that they might survive. The same thing in Josephus. He saw 3 of his friends crucified during the Jewish war. So he went to his friend, the Roman commander Titus, and asked a favor that he'd spare their lives. Titus, out of friendship to Josephus, granted their lives. And so all 3 were removed and provided the best medical care available to them at that time. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So here's the thing. Even if Jesus was removed from the cross intentionally and provided great medical care, his chances of survival were still small. But there is no evidence whatsoever that Jesus was removed while alive or provided any medical care whatsoever, much less Rome's best. So while historians can look at possibilities, historians are bound to go with probabilities. And given all the evidence we have for Jesus's death by crucifixion, without sufficient evidence to the contrary, the historian, that's at least as good, the historian must conclude that Jesus was crucified and the process killed him. Now, the only real evidence we have that Jesus survived crucifixion, a Muslim would say, would be the Quran, which was written 600 or more years after Jesus. Okay, 600 or more years after. Now, are you going to go with Gospels that are rooted, at least in eyewitness testimony? At minimum, at minimum, Mark and John. At the very minimum, scholars, the majority of critical New Testament scholars agree that Mark and John are rooted in eyewitness testimony. That means that if they're not written by eyewitnesses, Mark wasn't, of course, but John may have been by the beloved disciple, even if that wasn't John, the son of Zebedee. But critical New Testament scholars would say if John was not written by the beloved disciple served as the author's source for the majority of that gospel. And also the majority of critical New Testament scholars think that Mark's primary source was the Apostle Peter. So both are rooted in eyewitness testimony. John was written no more than 65 years after Jesus' death. Mark was written somewhere between 20 and 40 years after Jesus' death. Are you going to go with two sources rooted in eyewitness testimony, plus Paul, who's writing even earlier? Or are you going to go with a book that was written 600 years later? You can understand why historians do not use the Quran.